This week has already been packed, and it's only Tuesday. First, we're in another war, this time with Canada, and it's over trade, because Trump administration officials tried to stave off a trade war by launching a culture war with our neighbors to the north before these massive new tariff deadlines kicked in, which obviously backfired, and now that's going to raise prices on things we need as we head into the fall, the midterms, and the holiday shopping season. And then the Supreme Court handed the president his biggest election victory so far, letting his mail-in voting restrictions go through in one case. And it's not over yet, so we're going to talk about what's hype, what's not, and we're going to game out some of this to hopefully make some sense about what might happen. It's Tuesday, August 25th, 2026. Welcome to Make It Make Sense. I'm Grant Hermes. The U.S. and Canada are at war. Well, a trade war. Canada announced it was putting in place brand new tariffs, some as high as 50% on some 700 American goods coming into the country to retaliate for the same thing the U.S. will be doing to billions of dollars of Canadian imports. We are talking car parts, wood, oil and gas, which is wild because we get like 99% of our natural gas imports from Canada to do things like heat our homes and offices and cook our food. It's also taxes on things like steel and aluminum and other consumer goods. Overall, we're talking in the neighborhood of a combined $50 billion in trade that's now being taxed in both directions, and costs are going to go up. Trump likes to claim that the U.S. has a trade deficit with Canada around $60 billion. It's not. It's closer to $50 billion in just goods. That just means that we pay more to import stuff from Canada than Canada pays to import from us. Now, that doesn't account for the service surplus that we have with Canada, which is about $28 billion, so that cuts our overall trade deficit down to around $23 billion. That's not so bad, given the fact that our entire trade with Canada comes out to about $875 billion. And what the U.S. economy gets in the knock-on effect of jobs here at home, lower prices, more economic spending, and better taxes from companies that make more money off of that international trade, well, the deal that we got with Canada is pretty good. And Trump should know he's the one who signed it. He called it the fairest, most balanced, and beneficial trade agreement we have ever signed into law. It's the best agreement we've ever made. It was called the U.S.-Mexico-Canada Agreement, the USMCA, and he signed it in 2020. And now he hates it. The thing is, this trade war seemed to be entirely avoidable until, at least according to the Canadian negotiating team, the White House team that had been in talks over what to do about trade with our closest trading partner imploded within itself. Here's how Canadian Prime Minister Mark Carney explained it in a speech to Canadians last week, right before talks broke down. It's worth pointing out that on Tuesday last week, Trump said a deal had been brokered between the U.S. and Canada, which, in terms of wars, either real ones or trade ones, that's some real deja vu. But anyway, here's Carney.
The United States has continually changed the rationale for these actions, from fentanyl to taxes on U.S. tech giants, to certification of U.S. aircraft, to the sharing of tolls of a bridge that Canada built and paid for, to our dairy policy, to provincial decisions not to sell American alcohol during a trade war, to a television advertisement that quoted Ronald Reagan, to smoke from wildfires while they threatened our communities.
So, not unlike the other war we're in right now in Iran, the White House can't seem to nail down an objective and has now forced the other side to just walk away and keep shooting. Thankfully, in this case, it's just metaphorically. But what also really did these talks in wasn't just the erratic negotiations. It was that all of a sudden the White House started to demand Canada reduce its use of the French language, specifically in the province of Quebec, where French culture is dominant. The U.S. demanded that French be used less in public communications and TV programming, and the Canadians didn't just take offense to that because it's stupid, but they took it as a threat of attempted colonization by the U.S. Again, here's Mark Carney and the Premier of Ontario Province, so like their governor, Doug Ford.
We were not prepared to compromise Canada's sovereignty or to undermine our key industries. Nous n'étions pas prêts à faire de compromis sur notre
We were not
souveraineté,
prepared to accept any compromise on our sovereignty, protection of the French language, and our culture.
I don't respond to a dictator like President Trump, a bully like President Trump. As I said before, he's the type of guy in school that would take your lunch money one day, take your toque off your head the next day, and then steal your running shoes. But I'm not going to take any advice off a guy that's the king of bankruptcies.
A threat to sovereignty by a dictator, which, for a country that just celebrated 250 years of declaring independence from that specific thing, the irony of being accused of attempting to do it now to another country is a hard pill to swallow. But the issue here is, as always, the White House is doubling down. The president repeatedly called Canada a U.S. state, saying they want all the benefits of being a U.S. state without actually being one, which I don't really know what he means by that. They're an entirely separate country, and we have these trade deals that states aren't afforded. But then, at a rally in Maine this weekend, J.D. Vance also made a little joke.
China, you of course expect. They're our biggest economic competitor. I would expect that from China. I would not expect that from Canada. We have to remember, Canada is a state. Sorry, Freudian slip.
Look, the dude is just not funny. These things never land well for him. I don't know why they keep writing them for him. I will maintain that J.D. Vance just doesn't have the juice to be at the top of a presidential ticket for the Republicans in 2028, even if Trump has been telling donors privately that they need to get behind him. Anyway, the thing is, what Trump is doing with Canada isn't serious. It's what the strategy has been for the Republican Party when it comes to U.S. politics, going back to Richard Nixon and Ronald Reagan. It's called the Southern strategy. It's this thing that when polling isn't in your favor, which it's not for Trump, a poll found today that his approval rating is at 33%, his lowest ever. When the economy isn't in your favor, 25% of Americans right now are functionally unemployed, and feelings about the economy haven't been worse in more than 50 years, the playbook then is to make things a culture war. It's why for the midterms, we're hearing an awful lot about communism. There's just rampant Islamophobia being thrown around, and trans kids are being targeted again, because that stuff gets people riled up that isn't actually material to their lives, but it does strike at something they feel is about their identity. When Nixon and Reagan ran this play, it was about getting white Southerners and white voters to be mad about civil rights or black people or moral decline, quote unquote, but it's all the same thing. It's weird, though, to see it be used here because this is international politics. Canadians don't vote in U.S. elections, and American voters don't have a say in how Canada wants to run its economy. Now, unless Trump is picking this fight to energize Republicans who aren't excited to vote in November if they see Trump and the GOP as fighters for them against a foreign enemy, even if they're Canadians, maybe a few more might turn out to vote. Still, it's an odd choice that makes it look more like the president is just playing schoolyard dictator than actually running a real strategy. I mean, he threatened to rename Lake Ontario Lake America today, which, Canada isn't going to call it that, and it's not going to make our aluminum foil cheaper or keep the cost to heat our homes down this winter. The good news in all this stuff is that it doesn't kick in right away. Canada's tariffs don't go into effect until September 8th. The U.S. tariffs don't happen until 2027. The White House knows it can't make things more expensive before the midterms, and tariffs do that. So there is a lot of time for things to get ironed out, but if what Trump is going to do is play culture war to spin up his base to get them to turn out to vote, well, then we are in another war that no one asked for, and we're going to be paying an awful lot more for things when we needed the least. Okay, we're going to take a quick break, and when we come back, did the Supreme Court just open the floodgates for Trump's plan to undermine the midterms, or what's really happening here? Make It Make Sense is brought to you by Telos RX. This time of year, we're all getting back into a new routine. Maybe you've got kids heading back to school. Work starts to pick up with the fall around the corner, and maybe you've been thinking about getting into a new health routine too, but going to a doctor can be a hassle, especially if you're looking to lose weight and you've been running into walls. The cost, the wait list, the awkward waiting rooms. Telos RX just might be your answer. It's a telehealth platform that connects you with licensed medical providers online. You fill out an intake form, a verified licensed provider reviews your health history, and if it's right for you, they can prescribe a treatment plan. And if it's not the right fit, they'll tell you. This is a real medical evaluation, not a checkout page. Trustpilot gives TELUS-RX its highest rating, and they work with top-of-the-line weight loss drugs like semaglutides and tirzepatides. They even have a microdose option if you want to start small. And it's not just weight loss. They have plans for anti-aging and sexual health to help you feel your best no matter what you're going for. These are prescription medications. They're not for everyone, and they can have side effects. So talk to the provider about your history and what you can expect. There's no such thing as a magic shortcut, and anybody who tells you otherwise is selling you something. What TELUS-RX offers is easy access to a real provider who can tell you whether this makes sense for you. Go to TELUSRx.com or head to the link in the show notes. Prescriptions are required. They're only available if prescribed after consultation. Results may vary. This is not a substitute for professional medical advice. Talk to your doctor before taking any medications. On Monday, the Supreme Court issued another shadow docket ruling, handing the president his biggest win yet. In a 10-page, unsigned opinion, I cannot stress that enough, the conservative court majority stopped a federal court's block on Trump's new rule from the Postal Service that would allow USPS to prevent mail-in ballots from being delivered or returned. I've talked about and written about this executive order, what it means for USPS before, but it's time for a refresher on this. Back in March, Trump signed an executive order titled Ensuring Citizenship Verification and Integrity in Federal Elections. What this aimed to do was a few things. It said that federal agencies, but particularly DHS, Citizenship and Immigration, and the Social Security Administration, needed to work together to create a citizenship database of every American by altering what's known as the SAVE system, which is different from the SAVE Act. I know it's a bummer that they have the same name. The SAVE system is what the federal government uses to check immigration, tribal, and citizenship status of people to see if they're eligible for certain government programs or benefits. Then, the Postal Service would need to create a system where they would check mail-in ballot requests and the ballots themselves against that system to make sure the names matched the SAVE system. They would not verify voter eligibility or citizenship based on the list that DHS put together from lists that states would be forced to send in of their own citizens for the purpose of letting the federal government into their election process. Since then, in order to carry out this executive order, DHS and the Department of Justice have been attempting to force states to create these lists and or hand over private voter rolls with private data on them, and so far, the DOJ is 0 for 23 in that, because a federal judge has said you can't get access to that for reasons we'll talk about in a minute. And in a major ruling a few weeks ago, a federal judge said the way the administration had warped the SAVE system was so bad that they knowingly used bad citizenship data, and when they tried out this new bad list in states like Texas, actual citizens were denied their right to vote. So the federal judge said you can't use this system because it is so flawed, but also it violates multiple federal privacy laws. That gets us all the way back to the Supreme Court ruling this week. So as all this has been going on, there have been 2 lawsuits against the administration over the executive order, specifically the part about USPS creating this new rule that would let it decide whether it was going to do its congressionally mandated job of delivering the mail. One of those cases was brought by a handful of democratically led states who said this new rule from USPS would do harm to their ability to carry out their own elections as guaranteed in the Constitution, which it does guarantee in Section 2, which is why all those other judges have been saying, no, you do not have to hand over your voter rolls to the Department of Justice. That was the case the Supreme Court ruled on without signing it. Nobody put their name to it because they didn't want to. What they said was this case can't go forward, and the federal judge's order to block USPS from creating this rule not to deliver mail-in ballots needs to be lifted, not because the judge was wrong on the facts and merits of the case, but because they decided it too early. It's a legal idea called ripeness. What the conservative justices said, and we know it was the conservative justices, even though nobody signed this, because both Justice Sotomayor and Justice Jackson, liberals on the court, wrote their own dissenting opinions. But what the court overall said was essentially, because we didn't have a final rule published by the Postal Service, the federal judge couldn't put a stop to this case because we don't know what the rule is. And so the judge couldn't know the outcome, so actually it's the Trump administration that's being hurt, not the states. Essentially, they're saying the federal judge got their decision too soon and took too many leaps, despite knowing what's in the order, hearing arguments about the plans for it, and seeing draft orders of the rule from USPS. The Supreme Court did, however, hedge its bets in this case and said they could come back around to it, writing their take on this, quote, does not mean that any measure taken by the government to implement the order will necessarily be lawful. On that score, time will tell. But the thing is, time is running out, which is what Justice Jackson was arguing in her dissent. That's another legal idea called the Purcell principle. It comes from a 2006 case that says courts shouldn't change election law close to an election to avoid interfering with how those elections are run and causing general confusion among voters. Which letting this USPS rule go forward at this point would absolutely do. I've talked about before about how we're already inside this 90-day window where by law states can't change their voter rolls, so theoretically any new law that changes how they'd have to run their elections because of a new post office rule would also seem to apply here too because it would impact their voter rolls. But that might be for another case because, like I said, there are two cases targeting this executive order. The other is from a handful of private groups, including the League of Women Voters and Common Cause, making a similar but importantly different argument about this new postal service idea and the executive order preventing people who should be able to vote from voting. That case will absolutely be ripe when it hits the Supreme Court, and it will because tomorrow, as I'm recording this, the USPS rule will be made final and public, and it will have been in effect for a full week, meaning USPS will be trying to screen ballots using either an illegal list of deeply flawed citizenship data or blocking mail-in ballots entirely until DHS can create a list, which is exactly what Alexander Chandler from Protect Democracy, one of the plaintiffs in the lawsuit, said last week. The timing on this just doesn't work.
We're already at a point where, in all practicable purposes, it's not going to be possible for the USPS to actually implement this in time for the election, or for states to put together these portals in combination with USPS. So what this basically is again, ultimately part of the deceive and disrupt together, where it's, well, we tried to fix the fraud that doesn't exist with this order, and you somehow stopped us in the courts, and therefore, when we lose, that is part of the reason why we have to try to overturn the results.
You can go back and listen to that entire conversation with Alexander. She is just phenomenal and one of the best people right now explaining what is happening in this world. And on Friday, I'll have the CEO of Common Cause, one of the other lead plaintiffs in the only remaining lawsuit here, on the show to talk about what all this means for this case going forward and if this thing is really in dire straits, because we should game this out a little bit here. There's potentially a really big problem. If USPS follows the executive order, despite there not being time to create a list, then there is no list for the Postal Service to check ballots against, which means it won't either send ballots out or return them after you voted. 8 states and Washington, D.C. have entirely vote-by-mail elections. You have the option to vote in person in those states, but in states like Utah, 95% of people voted by mail in 2024. And if they don't know the rules have changed, that's a lot of people who won't get a say in this election. In fact, 1 in 3 Americans voted by mail in 2024. We are talking roughly 100 million people. So what happens here is either elections get decided by incredibly small turnout numbers, or members of Congress just don't get seated because states are suing or can't properly carry out their elections because they don't know where their ballots have ended up if they're being held or destroyed by the Postal Service. And what we get is a zombie Congress come January that doesn't really have any legal power to do anything, so most of the power gets even more concentrated under the president, who will do things with even fewer checks on his power. Now, that seems really grim, I know, and we should take a breath, because most experts don't think that's how this plays out. because it's important to remember that U.S. elections aren't one election, or 50 elections, or even 435 elections, but 10,000 or more local elections all happening at the same time. It is just too big to rig, even in a plan like this. So what this plan is then is a new door for the president to try to open to claim fraud in the election. And like 2020, we'll have to do this stuff all over again, and it'll be harder because he'll be in the White House instead of in the wilderness. But there is a long way to go with this stuff, and time, for once, is on the side of voters. Okay, that is it for today's episode. Please rate and review the show wherever you get the podcast. Become a paid subscriber to the Make It Make Sense Substack, where this week's Things You Forgot from Civics class is all about who owns the White House. As the president continues his major construction project on the White House grounds, it's still called the People's House, right? I get into the history of it and really who owns it, and the short answer is us, but the long answer is why you subscribe. And as always, share the show on social media. You can tag me at Grant Hermes on Twitter, Blue Sky, and the Say So News app, and at Grant_Hermes on everything else. Thank you so much for listening today. I'm Grant Hermes, and I'll talk to you next time.